My Uber driver's phone call made me realize he wasn't taking me home. I ordered the Uber at 11:47 p.m. from outside the Velvet Room downtown after my friends bailed on me early. The app said my driver's name was David Kowalski. 5 stars, and he'd be there in 3 minutes. I was exhausted from a long shift at the hospital and just wanted to get back to my apartment on Riverside Drive. When the silver Camry pulled up, I checked the license plate against the app and climbed into the back seat without really looking at the Balesh driver's face. That was my first mistake. The car smelled like coffee and mint gum, and there was a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. Normal enough. I gave him my address verbally, even though it was already in the app, and he nodded without saying anything. We pulled away from the curb and merged into late-night traffic, and I leaned my head against the window and closed my back eyes. My feet were killing me from standing in the operating room for 6 hours, and I still had the morning shift tomorrow. I was halfway to falling asleep when his phone rang. Not the usual ringtone you'd expect, but an old-fashioned telephone sound that seemed too loud in the quiet car. Answered it in Spanish, and his voice completely changed. It went from the soft, almost shy tone he'd used to confirm my address to something harsh and commanding that made the hair on my arm stand up. I don't speak Spanish fluently, but I grew up in Southern California and understand enough to catch fragments. He said something about La Chica and 20 minutos, and then he said an address I didn't recognize. Not my address. Somewhere on Industrial Boulevard near the warehouses. Snapped open, and I sat up straighter in the seat, watching the back of his head. He was still talking in rapid Spanish, and I heard him say, which I knew meant, as we planned. My heart started beating faster, because this didn't feel right. I pulled out my phone and checked the Uber app, and it showed we were still heading in the right direction toward my apartment, but the driver was talking about a completely different location. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was probably just discussing something unrelated to me. Maybe coordinating a pickup for another passenger later. But then he said, "No, pu escapar." And I knew that phrase. It means she can't escape. The Uber app showed my driver's face clearly now that I was actually looking at it. The man in the front seat had the same basic features. Dark hair, similar build. Something was off about the jawline. The photo showed a rounder face. And this man had a sharper, more angular structure. I zoomed in on the photo with shaking fingers and noticed a small scar above the left eyebrow in the app picture. The man driving had no scar. This wasn't David Kowalski. Someone else was driving this car with David's account. My mouth went dry, and I tried to keep my breathing normal so he wouldn't notice I was panicking. Still on the phone, and his tone had gotten even more aggressive. He said something about elf, which meant the boss wants. And then a name I didn't catch. I glanced at the door handle next to me and wondered if I could jump out at the next red light, but we were on the freeway, now going 60 miles per hour, and jumping would probably kill me. I needed a different plan. I opened my messages and started typing to my roommate, Bethany. But my hands were shaking so badly I kept hitting the wrong keys. Finally, I managed to type, "Wrong. Driver. Not going home. Call police." And I hit send just as the driver ended his call. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, and our eyes met for just a second. He'd seen me on my phone. He asked in English, with barely any accent, if I was comfortable back there, and his voice was friendly and casual, like nothing was wrong. I forced myself to smile and said I was fine, just texting my roommate that I'd be home soon. He nodded and turned his attention back to the road, but I saw his hands tighten on the steering wheel. I looked down at my phone and saw that my message to Bethany hadn't sent. No signal. I checked the bars at the top of my screen and saw nothing. He had a signal jammer in this car. That's when I knew for certain this was planned and deliberate, and I was in serious danger. My mind was racing through everything I knew about self-defense and survival from the hospital's workplace safety training. Stay calm. Don't let them know you're aware of the danger. Look for opportunities to escape, make noise, and attract attention if possible. We're on the freeway with cars zooming past in the dark. I checked the Uber app again and saw that it still showed us traveling toward my apartment, even though I could see through the window that we'd passed my exit 2 miles back. The app was fake or hacked or something. None of the technology I was supposed to trust was working. I was completely alone in this car with someone who'd planned this carefully enough to steal another driver's account, block cell signals, and spoof GPS tracking. The driver's phone rang again, and this time he answered in English. His accent was thicker now, less controlled, and I realized he'd been faking the lighter accent before. He said, "Yes." And 20 minutes, and the warehouse on Industrial, like always. And I felt my stomach drop. He listened for a moment, said, "No problems." She's quiet, and laughed in a way that made my skin crawl. When he hung up, he adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, and I saw him looking at me again. I pretended to be staring out the window at nothing, but I was actually watching his reflection. His expression had changed. He wasn't bothering to look friendly anymore. I asked him in the most normal voice. I could manage if he could turn up the heat because I was cold. He reached forward and adjusted something on the dashboard without answering, and warm air started blowing through the vents. I used that moment while his attention was divided to scan the inside of the car for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing in the back seat except me and my purse. I had pepper spray in my purse, buried under my stash, wallet and keys, and 1,000 other things. I slowly unzipped the main compartment and started feeling around for the small canister, trying not to make obvious movements. The driver took an exit I didn't recognize, and we started heading down streets that got progressively darker and more industrial, fewer streetlights, more empty lots, buildings with broken windows and graffiti. This was the part of the city where the hospital sent stabbing victims and overdoses from the doles, area where police didn't patrol unless they absolutely had to. My fingers finally closed around the pepper spray, and I pulled it out carefully, keeping it low and hidden against my leg. Safety was still on, and I couldn't risk the sound of clicking it off yet. I needed to wait for the right moment. The driver turned down a street that was completely dark, except for a single functioning streetlight about a block ahead. There were warehouses on both sides, their loading docks closed and secured with chains. No cars, no people, no witnesses. He slowed down and pulled into an alley between two massive concrete buildings, and my window of opportunity was closing fast. He put the car in park, but left the engine running and reached for something under his seat. That's when I made my move. Clicked off the safety on the pepper spray, lunged forward between the seats, and sprayed him directly in the face from 6 inches away. He screamed and threw his hands up, clawing at his eyes, and I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed the door handle and threw myself out of the car, hitting the pavement hard on my shoulder, my arm. But I forced myself to get up and run. Behind me, I could hear him yelling in Spanish, his voice raw and furious. And then, a car door slamming. I ran toward the streetlight I'd seen before, my hospital shoes slapping against the broken asphalt, my purse bouncing against my hip. My shoulder was screaming where I'd landed on it, but adrenaline kept me moving. The street light seemed impossibly far away, and I could hear footsteps behind me, getting Memon closer. He was recovering from the pepper spray faster than I'd hoped. There was a gap between two warehouses on my left, and I veered toward it without thinking, hoping it would lead somewhere, anywhere other than this dark alley. I squeezed through the narrow space, my jacket catching on something sharp and tearing, and came out into a bladge loading area behind the buildings. There were dumpsters and pallets and a dashed chain-link fence separating this property from the next. I could see lights on in a building about 2 blocks away through the fence, some kind of factory or processing plant that was running a process. Night shift. If I could get there, could find people and safety. Was about 8 feet tall with barbed wire across the top. I'd never climbed a fence in my life, but I didn't have a bit choice now. I could hear the driver squeezing through the gap behind me, still swearing in Spanish, his breathing harsh and angry. I jumped up and grabbed the chain link, my fingers threading through the metal diamonds, and started pulling myself up. My arms were shaking, and my shoulder felt like it was on fire. But I kept climbing. I was almost to the top when I felt a hand grab my ankle and yank downward. I kicked hard with my other foot and felt it connect with something soft, and the grip on my ankle loosened. I pulled myself over the top of the fence, feeling the barbed wire tear through my jacket and scrape across my back. And then, down the other side, I landed in a heap on the ground. The wind knocked out of bait at me and lay there gasping for a few seconds while my vision went spotty. The driver was climbing the fence behind me, much faster and more coordinated than I'd been. I forced myself to stand, even though my legs felt like jelly, and started running toward the lit building. My back was burning where the barbed wire had cut me, and I could feel wetness soaking into my shirt that was probably blood. The building got closer, and I could see it was some kind of meat processing facility. There were trucks backed up to loading docks and people moving around inside under bright fluorescent lights. I ran toward the nearest dock, where a man in a white coat and heret was checking something on a clipboard. I was screaming for help before I even reached him, my voice coming out hoarse and desperate, and he looked up with his mouth falling open in mind, shock. I stumbled up the concrete steps to the loading dock, and the man caught me before I fell. I was trying to tell him someone was chasing me, that I needed him to call 911, but the words were coming out jumbled and panicked. He guided me inside the building where it was warm and bright and smelled like raw meat and cleaning chemicals. Workers were staring at us, and someone was already on a phone calling for help. The man sat me down on a plastic crate and asked if I was hurt, and I told him about my back and my shoulder. A woman came over with a first aid kit and started examining the cuts on my back through my torn jacket, and she said they weren't as deep as they looked, but I'd need to get checked out properly. I asked if anyone had followed me inside, and the man said no. They'd locked the dock door behind me and hadn't seen anyone else. I couldn't stop shaking, and the woman wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. Even though it wasn't particularly cold in the building, the police arrived about 10 minutes later. 2 officers who took my statement while I sat there wrapped in the blanket. I told them everything, from the moment I got in the car to climbing the fence, and one of them was writing it all down in a notebook, while the other one radioed for more units to search the area. They found the silver Camry, abandoned in the alley where I'd escaped from it, and the engine still running. The phone I'd seen him using was gone along with whatever he'd been reaching for under the seat. But they found a laptop in the trunk that had software for hacking ride, share accounts, and GPS spoofing programs. There was also a duffel bag with zip ties, duct tape, and a syringe filled with something the police wouldn't tell me about until later. The real David Kowalski was found unconscious in his apartment with a head injury. Someone had broken in that afternoon, knocked him out, stolen his phone and car keys, and left him tied up in his bathroom. He'd been there for 8 hours before his girlfriend came over and found him. He had no connection to the man who'd used his account and his car, and the police said he'd been targeted specifically because his route that night would have taken him through my neighborhood at exactly the time I'd be leaving the bar. The detective who took over my case was named Vivian Cross, and she sat down with me in the hospital while they were stitching up my back. She said this wasn't a random attack or an opportunity crime. Someone had been watching me for weeks, learning my schedule and my habits and my regular hangouts. They knew I took Ubers home from the Velvet Room almost every Thursday night because my friends met there after work. They'd found 14 photos of me on the laptop in the car, taken from a distance over the past month. Me leaving the hospital in my scrubs, me getting coffee at the place near my Maris apartment, me walking into the Velvet Room. Detective Cross asked if I had any idea who might want to target me specifically, and I couldn't think of anyone. I didn't have enemies. I wasn't involved in anything dangerous. I was a surgical nurse who went to work and came home and saw the same 5 friends on a regular rotation. But then, Detective Cross showed me a photo from the laptop, and everything started making sense in the worst possible way. It was a screenshot from a news article about a May trial that had happened 6 months ago. A man named Victor Delgado had been convicted of running a trafficking operation that brought women across the Prostas border and forced them into various forms of labor. I'd been a witness in that trial because one of his victims had come through our emergency room with injuries that I'd reported to the Khan authorities. My testimony had been part of what put him away for 20 years. The article included a photo of me leaving the courthouse, and someone had drawn a fair and red circle around my face. Victor Delgado had 2 brothers, and both of them had disappeared from their known addresses right around the time the verdict came down. Detective Cross said they'd been looking for the brothers for months without success. The man who'd been driving the car was caught 3 days later, trying to board a bus to Mexico. His name was Rayoni Delgado, Victor's younger brother. He wasn't talking to the police, but the evidence from the laptop and the car was enough to charge him with kidnapping, assault, and a dozen other crimes. They never found the older brother, Luis, and Detective Cross said he was probably the one who'd been planning everything while Raon did the actual work. The police put a protection detail on me for 2 weeks, and I stayed with Bethy's parents in Oregon while they searched for Luis. I couldn't go back to my apartment because it didn't feel safe anymore, knowing that someone had been watching me come and go for weeks without me noticing. The hospital gave me a leave of absence, and I spent most of that time trying to process what had almost happened to me in that warehouse. Bethy's mom made me talk to a therapist, and I resisted at first because I didn't think I needed it. I'd escaped. I was fine. I just needed time to get back to normal. But the nightmares started about a week after the attack. I kept dreaming about being in the back of that car, hearing the driver's voice change on the phone, watching my message to Bethany fail to send. Sometimes in the dreams, I didn't get out of the car in time. Sometimes I made it to the fence but couldn't climb it. Sometimes I got caught, and I'd wake up sweating and gasping with Bethy's mom standing in the doorway asking if I was okay. Therapist helped me understand that almost dying changes something in your past brain. That feeling completely helpless, and then having to fight for your survival leaves marks that don't show up on the outside. She taught me techniques for managing the panic attacks that started happening randomly. I'd be in the grocery store or at the gas station, and suddenly my heart would start racing, and I couldn't breathe, and I'd have to sit down and count backwards from 100 sellers until it passed. After 3 weeks, Detective Cross called me with an update. They'd found Luis Delgado in Arizona, living under a fake name and working at a construction company. When they arrested him, he had a storage unit filled with surveillance equipment and more photos of me. He'd been planning to try again once things calmed down. Once I thought it was safe to go back to my normal life. The police found detailed notes about my schedule at the hospital, my roommate's work hours, the route I took to the gym 3 times a week. He'd been watching me for months, not weeks. The level of planning was so thorough it made me feel sick. Both brothers were going to trial, and the prosecutor said my testimony would be crucial again. I moved to a different city after that because I couldn't handle living in the same place where I'd been hunted like that. I transferred to a hospital in Seattle where nobody knew my story, and I got a studio apartment on the 8th floor of a building with security, cameras, and a doorman. I stopped taking Ubers completely. Now I only take buses or trains where there are other people around, or I walk. Even if it takes longer, I don't go out alone after dark anymore. I know that makes me sound paranoid. And my therapist says I'm working through trauma responses, but I can't bring myself to take the risk. Sometimes I think about how close I came to disappearing that night. If I hadn't been half awake enough to hear that phone call. If I hadn't understood enough Spanish to catch those specific words. If I hadn't had pepper spray in my purse. Or if I'd frozen instead of fighting. There are so many small choices that saved my life. The trial for both brothers happened about 6 months later, and I flew back to testify again. The prosecutor told me beforehand that Raon had taken a plea deal and was cooperating against Luis in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was going to testify about how they had planned the whole thing, how they had targeted me, specifically for revenge, how they had intended to kill me and make it look like I'd just disappeared after a night out. Sitting in that courthouse, listening to Raon describe in clinical detail what they had planned to do to me was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He didn't look at me once during his testimony. He just stared at the table in front of him and answered the prosecutor's questions in a flat monotone. They'd stolen David Kowalski's identity 3 days before the planned kidnapping. They'd tested the signal jammer in the car multiple times to make sure it worked, scouted the warehouse location, and prepared a room in the back where no one would hear me scream. Luis Delgado got life without parole. Ramon got 30 years. I testified at both sentencings about the impact their actions had on my life, about the panic attacks and the ball nightmares, and the constant fear that someone else might be watching me. The judge listened and nodded and said she understood the severity of the trauma they'd caused. But words on paper can't really capture what it feels like to know that 2 people spent months planning your murder and almost succeeded. After the trial, I thought I'd feel some kind of closure or relief, but I mostly just felt empty. The threat was neutralized. Both brothers were in prison, but I couldn't get back the sense of safety I'd had before that night. I couldn't undo the knowledge that danger could look like a normal Uber ride with a rosary hanging from the rear view mirror. My therapist said, "That's normal. That recovering from trauma isn't linear, and there's no timeline for feeling okay again." Detective Cross stayed in touch with me after everything was over. She told me she'd been a cop for 15 years and had worked dozens of kidnapping cases, but something about mine stuck with her. Maybe it was how close I'd come to vanishing completely. Or how much planning had gone into it, or how I'd managed to save myself with nothing but pepper spray and adrenaline. She said, "Most people in my situation either freeze or comply. And the fact that I'd bet Reviers fought back so aggressively probably surprised Ramon enough to give me the advantage I needed." She also told me something that made my blood run cold. The syringe they'd found in the duffel bag in the trunk contained a sedative strong enough to knock someone out for hours. If Raon had managed to inject me with it before I got out of the car, I wouldn't have been conscious enough to escape. The margin between life and death had been that narrow. I started teaching self-defense classes at a Goddard for Many Brast 80 community center in Seattle about a year after the attack. It was my therapist's idea, a way to take back power and help other people avoid what happened to me. I teach women how to recognize danger, signs, how to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, how to fight dirty when your life depends on it. I tell them my story, not all the details, because some parts are still too raw, but enough that they understand this isn't theoretical. I show them the scars on my back from the barbed wire. I demonstrate how to use pepper spray effectively, how to target the eyes and nose, how to spray and run without waiting to see if it worked. I teach them that escaping is always better than fighting, that the goal isn't to win a confrontation, but to get away and find help. Most of the women in my classes are there because something happened to them or someone they love, and we don't really talk about it directly, but you can see it in the way they practice the techniques, the intensity in their eyes, when they're learning how to break a Prosic, wrist grip or stomp on an instep. We're all carrying something. My life now is different from what it was before that night. I'm more careful, more vigilant, more aware of my surroundings in a way that sometimes feels exhausting. Drink when I'm out because I want to. Stay alert. I always check the driver's face against the app photo before getting in a car, and if something feels off even slightly, I cancel the ride and wait for a different one. I vary my routes home and my daily schedule, so no one can predict my patterns. I have 3 different brands of pepper spray in strategic locations in my apartment, my purse, and my gym bag. Some people might call this paranoia, but I call it survival. I know what happens when you have anxiety and bresses, let your guard down, when you assume everything is normal and safe. Just because it looks that way on the Unia surface. I learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Bethany visits me in Seattle a few times a year, and she tells me I seem different now. Not in a bad way, just more serious, less willing to laugh off things that might be dangerous. She's right. I can't watch true crime shows anymore without getting anxious. I can't hear about kidnapping cases on the news without my heart starting to race. But I'm also stronger than I was before in ways that matter. I know I can survive terrible things. I know I can fight when I need to. I know I'm not helpless, even when everything seems hopeless. Those aren't lessons anyone wants to learn, but they're valuable anyway. Sometimes I think about David Kowalski and wonder how he's doing. The hospital where I used to work told me he quit driving for Uber after what happened to him, and I don't blame him. Having someone steal your identity and use it to hunt another person has to leave its own kind of trauma. I thought about reaching out to him after the trial, but I didn't know what I'd say. The detective told me that cases like mine are becoming more common, that criminals are getting sophisticated about exploiting the trust people place in rideshare apps. They steal legitimate driver accounts. They use signal jammers and GPS spoofers. They plan carefully and target specific victims. She said, my case helped them develop new protocols for investigating rideshare crimes, new ways to verify driver identities, and detect when accounts have been compromised. It doesn't undo what happened to me, but at least something good came from it. Other people might be safer because I was willing to testify twice. First against Victor Delgado, and then against his brothers. That has to count for something. Late at night, when I can't sleep, I sometimes pull up the Uber app on my phone and just stare at it. I haven't used it in 2 years, but I can't bring myself to delete it either. It's like a reminder that normal-looking things can hide terrible dangers. Technology we trust can be used against us. The last time Bethany visited, she asked if I'd ever feel safe again. I told her honestly that I didn't know. Some days are better than others. Some days I can go about my life without constantly checking over my shoulder or jumping at unexpected sounds. Other days, the fear is right there under the buffet surface, ready to spike at the smallest trigger. But I'm learning to live with it, to accept that this is part of who I dine to, part of seed, am now, the woman who escaped, the woman who fought back, the woman who survived, when the people hunting her had planned every detail to make sure she wouldn't. I carry pepper spray everywhere I go, and I'm not ashamed of it. I take different routes home every day, and I don't apologize for being cautious. I refuse to feel guilty for protecting myself in a world where two men spent months planning to make me disappear. This is my life now, and I'm still here to live it. That has to be enough. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next